She was a hard-working single mother with a smile that could light up a room.
She had the perfect smile, perfect teeth, these big, bright eyes.
She always could make you laugh.
She was petite, but she was larger than life.
He was someone who could match her energy.
She wanted somebody to be an equal, to be a partner.
She had made like a Facebook post, oh, the love of my life. He was along for the ride.
But in the middle of a spring night, her life ends in unimaginable horror.
The violence, the trauma, that is serious anger.
She was tortured. That was hate, a demon. Just like, how evil could you be to do that?
Was it a case of unrequited love?
She had just broken up with him, and now she's dead.
This subject is scorned.
Or did a pattern of violence escalate to murder?
He's popping up at her job, stalking her.
He said that he was going to pick her up.
I think she knew that she had to get away.
The fact that my sister was screaming for her life and nobody heard her, it's haunting.
May 15th, 2016. It's a quiet night in Concord, California, a suburban community 30 miles east of San Francisco.
It's just one of those bedroom communities that grew and grew and grew.
Concord, California is a wonderful city. It has great schools, it has great neighborhoods. It's just a really nice place to raise a family.
But at 2:30 a.m., the quiet tranquility is broken by the sounds of sirens.
I was woken up in the middle of the night from my sergeant, and he asked that I respond for a possible homicide at Duck Pond at Newhall Park. A couple guys were out in the middle of the night going to fish, and they came across the victim.
This way, detectives.
Thank you, officer.
The scene was wrapped with crime tape. There was a couple officers out there kind of working scene security, and as I approached the pond, I could see the victim. She had a large laceration to her head that was obvious that she had suffered major trauma.
She had multiple fractures all over her face. She was beaten countless times, and she was also strangled. The attack was beyond brutal.
The victim had literally her fist shoved inside her mouth, and that's something I've never come across. It's right up there with some of the worst violence I've seen through the decades.
But who is this woman that suffered such a tragic fate?
Here you go, detective. Thank you.
The patrol cars have a portable fingerprint reader, and it's just like it sounds. You can take it out, put it up against somebody's thumb, then a match will show up.
When investigators scan the woman's prints, they get a hit.
The victim is 25-year-old Poinsettia Parks.
Born and raised in the suburbs of San Francisco, Poinsettia always stood out because of her small size.
Her friends called her Shorty. She was very, very small, very petite. She had the perfect smile, perfect teeth, these big, bright eyes.
What Poinsettia lacked in stature, she more than made up for in personality.
She was petite, but she was very mighty, and she just had a personality that was larger than life.
She always could make you laugh, and a lot of friends were attracted to her kindness and her funniness.
She just really, truly loved other people.
Never one to shy away from the spotlight, Poinsettia discovered a passion for the performing arts early in life.
She was very good at acting. She was in the Wiz at Pleasant Hill Middle School. And everybody came up to me afterwards asking me, where did she learn how to act? Where did she learn how to sing?
And as she grew into a young woman, she was determined to turn her passion into a career path.
I said, well, Poinsettia, what do you want to do? And she said, I want to do children's theater. And I said, well, all you have to do is start.
But at the age of 17, Poinsettia's plans for her future were put on hold when she and her high school sweetheart, Tyler Combs, got some surprising news.
She found out she was pregnant.
When she's pregnant, like, she'll stop everything she's doing. She'll eat healthy. She'll sit there and read to the baby. That's the type of mother she is.
And when her daughter Angelique was born, Poinsettia couldn't have been happier.
She was a good mother. Very, very energetic, very engaging.
It was always fun when I was with her. My mom was a happy person. She was goofy.
But as much as they loved their daughter, Poinsettia and Tyler struggled to adjust to their new role as parents.
It was difficult because she had postpartum depression for a while.
It was too expensive. How soon can two teenagers from the Bay Area get their stuff together? This is Silicon Valley. If you're not making 6 figures or more, how long is it really going to take for you to get it together?
Poinsettia and Tyler did not end up staying together. They broke up.
In the wake of the breakup, Poinsettia's family stepped in to help with baby Angelique.
Our great aunt would come, get her, every weekend. And then she was like, well, let me just keep her. Let me keep her until you get yourself together.
She wanted to be a good mom. And I would take her up to see her daughter. We'd go to the park.
And I remember being at the park with her, and we were running around, having fun. And she was just super joyful.
She was looking forward to doing whatever she had to do to get her back.
Even if that meant working around the clock to save up money for an apartment.
She wanted to better her life and be able to provide for her young daughter.
At that time, she worked in a beauty supply store, and then she also worked for security at Safeway, which everybody thought was hilarious because you got this tiny person chasing after criminals.
It was pretty dangerous, but she was just fearless.
By her early 20s, Poinsettia was also fearless in love.
She was dating, getting to know people.
She wanted somebody to be an equal, to be a partner, a supportive person, that you support them and they support you.
How you doing, baby?
Hi.
So when Poinsettia began building a relationship with 26-year-old Eric Lamar Nelson, he seemed like just the supportive partner she'd been searching for.
He wasn't scared off by the fact that she had a child.
She thought he was good looking. He was tall.
I'm really excited to go out tonight.
Yeah?
Work has been really crazy.
The first time I was made aware of Eric was around Christmas. She had made a Facebook post, oh, the love of my life, and where would I be without you?
She never had a long, steady relationship for a long, long time. I think that's what she wanted.
And she finally found someone who was also along for the ride.
But now, Poinsettia has been found murdered at a park in Concord, California.
The brutality of it definitely stands out.
The amount of blows and damage was definitely shocking. She had lacerations all over her face. She had a broken nose. She had bruising from her chin down to her clavicle.
Her hand, was found in her mouth.
When her hand was removed, it was learned that her tongue was actually split in half. There is no way that you can look at the injuries that Poinsettia sustained and not think that this was personal.
Investigators believe Poinsettia's killer was trying to send a message.
I think the splitting of her tongue and shoving her hand in her mouth was symbolic.
To me, it seems that somebody might have been upset about something she was going to say.
That definitely is sending a message that I am silencing you.
But who was trying to silence Poinsettia, and why?
It's definitely something that would only be done with a lot of anger behind it.
25-year-old Poinsettia Parks was working hard to create a safe haven for her young daughter, with her boyfriend Eric Nelson by her side.
She held 2 jobs. She was hardworking. She had goals.
She had the intent to get her daughter back and just starting anew.
But when Concord police discover Poinsettia brutalized and left for dead at a local fishing pond, the hunt is on for her killer.
It's obvious that there was some anger involved. Shoving someone's hand inside their mouth, it's definitely something that would only be done with a lot of anger behind it.
As investigators scour the area for clues, they discover that the fight for Poinsettia's life began in a nearby parking lot.
They found Poinsettia's wig kind of up near the parking lot area. They found a lot of different markings with blood.
It's plausible that some type of argument occurred in or around their car, that it became violent, and at some point, either the victim ran or the victim fought.
There was a struggle from the parking lot all the way down to the pond. There was a guardrail that separated the parking lot from the pond, and on that guardrail was a palm print, and it was blood.
We took photos of it, and we ended up taking the entire guardrail, preserved it.
As the sun comes up over Northern California, detectives head to the home of Poinsettia's mother, Andrella Bohanna.
Given these type of notifications, they're difficult. We knocked on the door, identified ourselves, and she could tell something was wrong immediately.
I look at him, and then I'm like, is it my daughter? And after they told me, I dropped to the floor and I just screamed and cried.
Andrella tells the detectives that Poinsettia's death is even more devastating because of something her daughter told her a few weeks earlier.
Poinsettia, she was pregnant.
She was expecting another child. She was 6 weeks pregnant.
She was trying to keep a secret. She was trying to hint around, but she can't hold water. She just had to blurt it out.
Do you know who the father of the child was?
Yes, his name is Eric Nelson.
Andrella tells detectives that Poinsettia and Eric had dated for about 9 months. But recently, the young couple split up.
With the added pressure of a pregnancy, their relationship just couldn't cut it.
Do you think he'd be involved in with what happened last night?
Eric? I don't think so.
I just didn't think of Eric that he would want to actually hurt her. I mean, I know they had arguments and stuff, but I didn't think he would hurt her.
Since her breakup with Eric, Andrella says her daughter had actually started dating someone new, a man named Gerald Cook.
What can you tell us about him?
Not much, but I know that he worked with Poinsettia. That's how they met.
Gerald also worked at the Safeway, where Poinsettia worked security.
The relationship started off as friends, and then you spend a lot of time with someone, you start developing like romantic feelings for them.
Detectives are eager to speak with Gerald Cook. But first, they have another important question for Poinsettia's mother.
Is your daughter's car here? We did locate it from the crime scene.
No.
Her car is a green 4-door vehicle. As far as her mom knew, Poinsettia doesn't share the car with anyone, so the car should have been wherever she is. It's very possible that the suspect is with her vehicle.
Police issued an APB advising law enforcement agencies in the area to keep an eye out for Poinsettia's car.
Thank you for your time, ma'am. We're sorry again for your loss.
The tragic news quickly spreads to the rest of Poinsettia's family.
I remember being with my aunt and she got a phone call and she stepped outside, and then when she came back, she was crying and upset, and I kept asking her what happened. She didn't want to tell me, and then finally she told me, like, your mother passed away. I wasn't really sure what to think or how to feel in the moment. It definitely was a weird feeling.
I didn't want to believe what I was hearing. I fell to the ground and had an anxiety attack. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was being suffocated, like somebody was jumping up and down on my chest like it was a trampoline. So it just was very overwhelming.
Back at the station, detectives bring Poinsettia's new boyfriend, Gerald Cook, in for questioning.
Gerald was concerned. He wanted information. He wanted to know what happened.
She was found dead earlier this morning.
What?
He genuinely appeared to be upset learning what had happened to Poinsettia.
And you two were in a dating relationship. Is that correct?
Well, we were. Until yesterday.
Gerald said that Poinsettia had just broken up with him hours before she was found dead.
At this point, you don't know how into this relationship Gerald was, right? And then it's cut off out of nowhere, and how would he react to that?
She had just broken up with him, and now she's dead. It's not looking good.
May 2016, Concord, California. Detectives investigating the brutal murder of pregnant mother Poinsettia Parks are speaking with a man she'd recently been dating before she was killed, a coworker named Gerald Cook.
You look at acquaintances, you look at friends, somebody caused these injuries. As far as who and why, you don't know yet.
And this was a very personal attack on her.
Gerald has just revealed that he and Poinsettia broke up the day before her body was discovered.
I think he was aware that it looked suspicious. She had just broken up with him, and now she's dead.
How long were you two together?
Since April.
They were dating about a month. She'd spent a lot of time with him, even spending time with his family.
Were there any issues between you and Poinsettia?
No, never.
He appeared to have genuine feelings for her.
He has nothing but positive things to say about my sister. Like, he really liked her.
He was hoping that they could become more serious.
But Gerald says Poinsettia wasn't on the same page.
When she called to break up with me, it was around 6:15 p.m. And that was on the 15th. Really? Are you sure?
It felt like just out of the blue, right?
She said she had made some type of plans to go down to Las Vegas.
She was going to move in with her sister.
I'm sorry. I just can't do the long distance thing right now.
She said, I need a new start. She didn't really specify what she wanted to do. She just needed to get out of the area. She needed a new environment. And so we agreed that she would come to Vegas and live with me and just start over.
When Poinsettia, broke it off with Gerald, he was obviously upset.
That's what you really want?
I'm sorry.
Bye.
You have to consider the possibility that this subject is scorned. He finds out possibly that this developing relationship is going to come to an end, and he could be upset about that. He could act out. He could get violent.
So where were you last night, Gerald?
I was at home, just playing video games, trying to take my mind off things.
Gerald insists he would never do anything to hurt Poinsettia, but he says there's someone else who might.
Have you guys talked to her ex-boyfriend, Eric?
No. Why?
Listen, that guy's a straight-up psycho.
According to Gerald, Eric Nelson has been acting strange ever since Poinsettia broke up with him.
Gerald informed detectives that her ex was showing up at her job. He had been keeping tabs on her.
He would come into the store and follow her around. Eric even broke a window in her car.
But is Gerald telling the truth, or is he just trying to lead investigators off his trail?
You have a conversation with Gerald, and you take the information you gather and you consider it, but he's not ruled out yet.
You have to determine, what do I have that can prove or disprove his story?
Detectives begin reaching out to Poinsettia's friends and coworkers to verify Gerald's account of Eric Nelson's alarming behavior.
There were things that had happened in the past few weeks or past couple months that employees had witnessed related to Eric's badgering and hassling of Poinsettia.
When a friend of Poinsettia's named Justin Marsh comes in, he's able to provide detectives with shocking new details about the couple's tumultuous relationship.
Thank you for coming in, Justin.
Of course.
That particular friend, he took effort into trying to look after Poinsettia.
Which meant protecting her from Eric.
This guy's dangerous.
This friend had noticed the escalation of his behaviors. And it wasn't just little things being said here and there. These were like big gestures, making threats, stalking her.
He had a lot of little bits that gave him justification for thinking that Eric was related to this.
Especially because of something that happened a couple weeks ago.
Apparently, before Poinsettia worked up the courage to leave Eric, she made a shocking discovery amongst his belongings.
He was using meth.
That was the final straw for her. Poinsettia didn't want her children around that.
She was ready to cut Eric out of her life for good.
So she sent Justin to return Eric's possessions.
He had brought property to Eric from Poinsettia just so she didn't have to see him. And when he dropped off this property, he was upset.
Where Poinsettia at? She's not here. It's just me.
Little.
He said that he was going to her up.
Detectives investigating the murder of 25-year-old Poinsettia Parks have a new prime suspect, her ex-boyfriend and father of her unborn child, Eric Nelson.
He was stalking Poinsettia. He was harassing Poinsettia.
And Poinsettia's friend Justin says the situation had recently progressed into a ticking time bomb.
After they were broken up, she sent me to give him some of his stuff back.
She didn't want any contact with him.
Where Poinsettia? She's not here. It's just me.
What?
That little what?
He said, when I dropped off our property, Eric was upset, and he said that he was going to f her up.
Normal, rational people are gonna move on from that point. But in this case, his reaction, no. This guy wants a confrontation, is what he wants.
I ain't playing, man.
What's that supposed to mean? Huh?
Justin says not long after that, Eric paid Poinsettia a visit at work.
I just want to talk to you.
Leave me alone and get the hell out of here, please, Eric!
He became violent with Poinsettia.
Eric ripped her wig off, which is the ultimate form of like humiliation.
Now what?
He did that in front of people with the intention of embarrassing her, with the intention of demeaning her.
To detectives, this incident is especially telling.
They found Poinsettia's wig at the crime scene, ripped from her head, just like the incident Justin is describing. It suggests a pattern of abuse.
He just wouldn't leave her alone.
Justin says as hard as Poinsettia tried to rid herself of Eric, he refused to back down.
What are you doing here? I love you. I cannot live without you, baby. Please, I cannot live without you, baby.
There was an incident where apparently Eric had ingested pine salt and was chasing Poinsettia around saying he's gonna kill himself and she's gonna witness it.
This may have been his last-ditch effort to control her. Okay, you're gonna leave, I'm gonna kill myself so that you can live with this forever.
But Poinsettia held her ground.
I need to talk to you.
Get out!
I need to talk to you.
Poinsettia realized that the only way to finally rid herself of her ex was to leave town altogether.
Jesus.
We spoke 2 days prior to her murder, she called me and she asked if she could come move to Las Vegas. And she said, you know, I want to just start over.
I think Poinsetta knew that she was in danger. And I think she knew that she had to get away.
Tragically, Poinsetta never got the chance to make her fresh start.
48 hours later, she was dead.
And detectives now believe they've identified the man responsible for taking her life.
Eric was the primary suspect in this investigation.
But tracking down Eric Nelson is complicated.
You try and find contact information for him, but he didn't have a recent address and he didn't have his own cell phone. He would borrow phones, so it was difficult.
Investigators discovered that this isn't Eric's first run-in with the law. Not by a long shot.
Mr. Nelson had a pretty significant criminal history.
He had crimes of violence, he had property crimes, he had narcotic-related crimes.
While they wait for leads on Eric's whereabouts, investigators continue building their case against him. And when detectives receive a call from the coroner's office, they have another breadcrumb to follow.
During the autopsy, they look at the victim's clothes, and inside one of her front pockets, she had a receipt from the grocery store within a couple miles of the duck pond.
And so Concord Police Department holds surveillance from that grocery store.
Just after the purchase was made inside the store, which was a notebook, she can be seen exiting the store.
And she's not alone.
Boom. That's him.
It's clear that she's exiting the store with Eric.
Investigators now have footage placing Eric with Poinsetta just 4 hours before her body was discovered.
That's a huge piece of evidence, without question.
In the weeks before she was murdered, Poinsetta Parks was desperately trying to escape an abusive relationship with Eric Lamar Nelson.
Stop! Get out!
She definitely feared him, and she knew that she needed to physically and emotionally separate herself from him.
Now, homicide detectives have discovered surveillance video that places Poinsetta with Eric just a few hours before she was found dead in a local park.
Boom. That's him.
The fact that you see her exit the store with Eric, that was our first real solid digital evidence to show that he was physically with her really close to the time that she was located.
He was the last person to be seen with her.
But after days of searching for their suspect, Eric is still nowhere to be found.
Once police exhausted all their avenues to locate Eric, it became apparent he wasn't just a hard man to find. He was actually on the run.
There wasn't really anybody that you could go to and really develop good information on his whereabouts.
He had friends and family here and there that were willing to help him evade the law.
But detectives do get one useful tip from Eric's parole officer.
A lot of times, Eric would stay with his friend, Wayne Robbins. He could possibly be hiding out there.
We eventually contacted Wayne, who came down to speak to us.
In a police interview room, Wayne is reluctant to provide the investigators with much information.
Information had to be kind of pulled out of him. He gave a lot of yes and no, vague answers.
However, Wayne does admit that Eric showed up at his house around 1 a.m. on the night Poinsetta was killed.
What type of car was he driving?
A green sedan.
Eric showed up at his confidant's home in Poinsetta's car without Poinsetta.
Hey, man. You okay? I've been trying to reach you all night. Yeah, I'm fine.
He said that Eric his term was heartbroken about the separation from Poinsetta.
But Eric wasn't just heartbroken, he was also angry.
Mr. Nelson had a pretty significant criminal history, and at the time of this murder, Mr. Nelson was on parole for robbery.
Poinsettia had told Eric that she was going to contact his parole officer as like a last effort just to get him to stay away.
If Mr. Nelson didn't leave her alone, she was going to go to his parole agent and tell the agent about all the things that Mr. Nelson had been doing, including his harassment.
For detectives, this information calls to mind an important detail from the crime scene.
She was found with her tongue slit and her hand shoved in her mouth.
This was the first time and the only time we learned of any detail that could explain why Poinsettia had her hand shoved in her mouth.
It was symbolic of his efforts to silence her, to prevent her from speaking to his parole officer.
Where's Eric now?
Oh, no, I haven't seen him since that night.
Wayne claims that when he woke up the next morning, Eric was gone, and so was Poinsettia's car.
But even with Eric still on the lam, police finally locate Poinsettia's missing vehicle on May 25th.
Poinsettia's car is found in Stockton, which I think is about 30 to 40 miles away.
It was located basically in a kind of an abandoned state. It had the driver's side window shattered.
They looked over the car and found that the car had intentionally been lit on fire.
The vehicle did not become completely engulfed, but there was a lot of black soot in the car. The passenger seat was destroyed during the fire.
Despite the extensive damage, one piece of evidence survived the blaze.
Look at this.
There was what appeared to be the rings from a notebook. That has relevance because Poinsettia had purchased a notebook at the grocery store that she was seen on video with Eric the night before she was located at the park.
It's even more evidence tying Eric to Poinsettia on the night she was killed. But where is he now?
They searched the car extensively. They canvassed the area, but no one knew where Eric was.
However, that changes when a call comes in to Concord police from out of state.
A little more than a week after Poinsettia was located, we received a call from Reno Police Department.
Detective Bardella speaking.
Eric has stolen another vehicle.
He drove off the side of the road.
I believe it was a coward move.
For more than a week, California police have been searching for Eric Nelson, the prime suspect in the murder of Poinsettia Parks.
He was on the run. It's like we were right behind him each time.
But now, Concord detectives learn that after setting Poinsettia's car on fire and abandoning it in Stockton, Eric had stolen another vehicle.
He drove off the side of the road, off the side of the freeway. He was injured, but he was able to walk away from the collision.
He then hitched a ride from two Good Samaritans that didn't know who he was to a local church. And then at the church, he told the pastor that he was wanted for a murder in California.
Fortunately, the pastor encouraged Eric to turn himself in.
Reno police at that time informed us that they had Eric in custody. I think that Eric, in the end, a lack of family, a lack of friends, a lack of locations to go to, he probably was tired of running.
Thanks. I'll be there soon.
When Concord detectives arrive in Reno, Eric agrees to speak with them.
He waived his Miranda rights and agreed to speak to me, but he was very limited in information that he would share.
Eric says the car crash was another attempt to take his own life.
I just don't want to be here anymore.
He, in his own words, tried to commit suicide.
I believe he didn't want to get shot down. I believe it was a coward move.
Did you kill Poinsettia?
No.
He didn't admit to being the primary suspect in this homicide. He didn't admit to being with Poinsettia at the time of the incident or prior.
And how do you explain this video from last Sunday?
I brought up the footage of Poinsettia and Eric in the grocery store, and he dismissed it, saying something similar to, "Oh, you've got video."
By the end of the interview, investigators are ready to charge him with first-degree murder.
I would have liked to have a confession, of course, but that would have been more the cherry. That wasn't the cake.
In this case, the evidence just speaks for itself.
And when Eric's trial begins in March 2021, prosecutors let the evidence do all the talking.
Mr. Nelson knew that Poinsettia was moving on, and he did not want her to move on.
He was losing his power and control. That's what it's about.
There was nothing that made me think that he was going to be content with their relationship coming to an end.
No one knew exactly how, but Eric must have talked Poinsettia into letting him accompany her to the store on the afternoon of May 15th.
I would think that they were spending time together, probably because Eric had forced himself upon her.
It's hard to completely cut the father of your child out of your life, which is why Poinsettia was planning to move to Las Vegas in the next couple of days.
I think that she knew that something was about to happen, and she was trying to buy herself some time.
They go to the park, they have a conversation. Something happens, something that makes Eric become super angry.
I need you to understand that this is over for good.
Mr. Nelson knew that either Poinsettia was going to be moving to Las Vegas with his child, or if he didn't leave her alone, she was going to snitch on him and tell his parole officer about the things that he had been doing.
He was a violent criminal. He had 2 strikes already.
In California, there's what's called the 3 strikes law. If Eric was convicted of another crime, he was running the risk of a life sentence.
Oh, you're gonna regret this.
Prosecutors believe that's what ultimately convinced Eric to silence Poinsettia forever.
He did what Eric does, get physical. And I can only imagine the brutality of it. It wasn't over in a second.
It's not easy to kill somebody, beating him to death. It takes time.
Seeing the injuries that were inflicted upon Poinsettia, I had never seen anything quite like that. It was such a vicious and sustained attack.
Poinsettia was 6 weeks pregnant, and it's like, wow, not only did you kill her, you also killed this baby that was inside of her. Just like, how evil could you be to do that?
As the prosecution rests their case, they offer one final piece of evidence they say proves Eric's guilt beyond any doubt.
When law enforcement processed the crime scene, they located a bloody handprint near the edge of the pond.
That palm print matched Mr. Nelson's palm print.
It doesn't take long for the jury to reach their verdict.
When the jury found Mr. Nelson guilty, I felt this overwhelming sense of just, thank you for serving justice. And I knew that Poinsettia's mom and her sister were right behind me in the courtroom.
I was relieved. It doesn't give you closure, though. None of it gives you closure.
The judge sentences Eric to 85 years to life in prison.
He don't need to be on the street. Justice needed to be served.
Hopefully Eric never gets out and never is in the position to do something like that to anybody else.
But even with Eric locked up for decades to come, Poinsettia's loved ones can never forget the horrors he inflicted on their family.
My sister died a brutal death. I'm talking about painful. The fact that my sister was screaming for her life and nobody heard her, Like nobody was there. It's haunting. It's haunting to be a big sister.
She got taken away from me from when I was 7, and I haven't got to experience the mother-daughter relationship, and there's much more to come with that, which I won't get to experience.
He took a precious gift from God, a precious gift. Now she's up in heaven with the angels.
On an ordinary spring afternoon, 8-year-old girls should have been thinking about bicycles, schoolyard games, and the long summer waiting just around the corner. Instead, on April 1st, 1988, a quiet neighborhood in Fort Wayne, Indiana, became the opening chapter of one of America's most haunting cold cases. It began with a child who simply disappeared. No screams echoed through the streets. No witnesses came forward with a dramatic account. There was only silence. Silence that would stretch across nearly 3 decades before science finally spoke louder than fear. For years, investigators would revisit the same streets, the same evidence, the same unanswered questions, wondering whether the man responsible had vanished forever. Long before genetic genealogy transformed criminal investigations, before DNA databases linked strangers through distant family trees, detectives had little more than determination, fragments of physical evidence, and the hope that someday technology would catch up with the truth. At the center of that hope was a little girl named April Tinsley. She was 8 years old, full of energy, known by neighbors as a cheerful child who enjoyed riding her bicycle around the quiet residential blocks near her home. The neighborhoods of Fort Wayne in the late 1980s projected the image of suburban security. Children rode their bikes without constant supervision. Families trusted familiar streets lined with modest homes, green lawns, and sidewalks where neighbors recognized one another by name. It was precisely the kind of community where unimaginable violence seemed impossible. That illusion shattered on the afternoon of Friday, April 1st. April left her home to ride her bicycle, something she had done countless times before. Nothing about the day suggested that history was quietly unfolding. Hours passed. As daylight faded, concern replaced routine. Family members searched nearby streets. Friends checked familiar locations. When she failed to return home, panic spread rapidly through the neighborhood. Calls were made. Police officers arrived. Search teams formed almost immediately, joined by volunteers desperate to find the missing child before darkness settled over Allen County. The first hours after a disappearance are often the most critical. Officers canvassed neighborhoods, questioned residents, searched parks, fields, drainage ditches, and vacant lots. Every passing minute increased the fear that investigators were no longer looking for a lost child, but racing against an unknown predator. Throughout that first night, hope remained alive. Missing children are frequently located within hours. Police wanted to believe April had wandered farther than expected or accepted a ride from someone familiar. But beneath those possibilities lay a darker suspicion that experienced investigators understood all too well. Children rarely vanish without leaving traces. The absence of evidence was itself becoming evidence. The following day brought devastating confirmation that the case had transformed from a missing person investigation into a homicide. On April 2nd, a jogger discovered April's body in a ditch along a rural road in neighboring DeKalb County, roughly 20 miles from where she had disappeared. The location suggested deliberate transportation. Whoever had taken her had driven away from the city before abandoning the crime scene in an isolated area where discovery might be delayed. News spread through Fort Wayne with astonishing speed. Parents who had allowed their children freedom only days earlier suddenly refused to let them out of sight. Schools addressed frightened students. Local media interrupted normal programming with urgent updates. Detectives secured the scene while forensic specialists carefully documented every detail that might identify the killer. The examination of the body revealed the brutality of the crime. April had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered. For investigators, the emotional weight of crimes involving children is unlike almost any other. Yet every detective at that scene understood that grief could not interfere with procedure. Every footprint, every fiber, every biological sample had to be preserved. They were collecting evidence not only for the investigation unfolding before them, but perhaps for technologies that did not yet exist. In 1988, DNA analysis remained in its infancy. The forensic revolution that would later solve thousands of cold cases had barely begun. Detectives relied heavily on interviews, eyewitness accounts, fingerprints, vehicle descriptions, offender profiling, and traditional police work. Biological evidence could sometimes exclude suspects, but identifying an unknown offender through DNA alone was still years away from becoming practical. Nevertheless, crime scene technicians preserved critical forensic material with extraordinary care, decisions that would ultimately prove invaluable decades later. Meanwhile, investigators worked tirelessly to reconstruct April's final movements. They retraced her bicycle route. They interviewed classmates, relatives, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen suspicious activity that afternoon. Hundreds of tips flooded police headquarters. Every unfamiliar vehicle became significant. Every rumor demanded investigation. Every registered sex offender in the surrounding region received renewed attention. Detectives developed multiple theories. Was the offender local? Had he specifically targeted April, or had she become the victim of opportunity? Did he know the neighborhood well enough to blend into everyday life? The uncertainty proved maddening. Then the investigation took an even more disturbing turn. Approximately 3 years after the murder, residents began discovering anonymous notes left for young girls. The handwritten messages contained horrifying references to April Tinsley and suggested intimate knowledge of the crime. Their language was threatening, taunting, and deeply unsettling. They implied that whoever had killed April remained free and wanted the community to know it. The psychological impact was immediate. Parents feared not only an unidentified murderer, but one who appeared willing to communicate directly with children. Schools warned students never to accept messages from strangers. Police urged families to report every suspicious letter, every unusual interaction, every unexplained object found near homes or schools. The anonymous communications became some of the most chilling aspects of the investigation because they transformed the killer from an invisible figure into an active presence. Detectives analyzed the handwriting, the wording, the paper, the ink, and the locations where the notes appeared. Behavioral experts examined the messages for clues about personality, education, emotional state, and possible age. The author appeared confident, manipulative, and eager to control public fear. Whether motivated by arrogance, compulsion, or a desire for attention, the writer seemed convinced he could continue taunting investigators without consequence. Despite intensive analysis, the letters failed to identify their source. Years continued to pass. The headlines faded. New crimes replaced old ones in newspaper columns. Detectives retired, transferred, or accepted promotions. Yet the file bearing April Tinsley's name never truly closed. It remained one of Indiana's most painful unsolved child murders, revisited whenever new forensic techniques emerged. Each advancement offered another opportunity to re-examine preserved evidence. Every few years, investigators reopened boxes containing photographs, reports, laboratory submissions, interview transcripts, and physical exhibits. New detectives inherited the responsibility of solving a crime committed before some of them had even entered law enforcement. They read thousands of pages documenting countless interviews and investigative leads that had ultimately reached dead ends. The challenge facing every new investigator was enormous. How do you find one unknown man among millions when witnesses have forgotten faces, memories have faded, and physical evidence grows older with every passing year? Yet experienced cold case detectives understand something crucial. Evidence does not forget, human memory weakens. Witnesses move away. Suspects age. But properly preserved forensic evidence remains remarkably patient. It waits quietly inside evidence lockers until science becomes capable of asking better questions. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, advances in DNA profiling dramatically reshaped criminal investigations across the United States. Cases once considered impossible suddenly found answers through genetic comparisons. Investigators in the April Tinsley case repeatedly submitted preserved biological evidence for testing as laboratory methods improved. Each advancement narrowed possibilities, but no match appeared in existing criminal databases. Whoever had committed the murder either had never submitted DNA to law enforcement or remained entirely outside available systems. That realization carried disturbing implications. The killer could have been living an ordinary life while one of Indiana's most infamous child murders remained unsolved. He could have built a career, raised a family, attended neighborhood events, and interacted daily with people who never imagined they were standing beside a man linked to one of the state's darkest crimes. For the victim's family, every passing anniversary reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Birthdays became reminders of years never lived. Community memorials honored a child forever frozen at 8 years old while the unknown offender continued aging somewhere beyond public suspicion. Detectives refused to surrender, but privately many wondered whether justice would ever arrive. The investigation had consumed extraordinary resources, generated thousands of leads, and survived multiple generations of investigators. Still, the central question remained painfully unchanged. Who had taken April Tinsley, and where was he now? Unknown to everyone involved, the answer had already been preserved since the first days of April 1988, not in a witness statement or a forgotten confession, but within microscopic biological evidence quietly waiting for a scientific breakthrough that would not arrive until nearly 30 years later. At the time, no detective could have predicted that the key to solving one of Indiana's longest-running cold cases would eventually emerge not from a traditional suspect, but from the rapidly evolving science of human ancestry itself. As the months turned into years, the investigation entered a phase familiar to every major cold case. Relentless efforts slowly gave way to frustrating repetition. Detectives revisited the same witness statements, re-examined the same photographs, retraced the same timeline, and asked the same painful question that had haunted Fort Wayne since April 1988. Somewhere, someone knew something. Somewhere, the man responsible for abducting, sexually assaulting, and murdering 8-year-old April Tinsley was continuing his life as though nothing had happened. Yet every promising lead seemed to dissolve under scrutiny, leaving investigators with mountains of paperwork but no arrest. Unlike many homicide investigations driven by obvious motives such as robbery, domestic conflict, or revenge, this crime appeared disturbingly random. April had not been targeted because of a family dispute or personal relationship that investigators could immediately identify. She had simply been a child riding her bicycle in her own neighborhood. That reality made the case infinitely more frightening. If the killer had selected his victim at random, then every family with young children wondered whether another attack was inevitable. Police responded by expanding the investigation far beyond Allen County. Detectives compared April's murder with child abductions and sexual assaults throughout Indiana and neighboring states. They searched for similarities in offender behavior, transportation methods, crime scene characteristics, and victim profiles. Behavioral analysts from the Federal Bureau of Investigation assisted local authorities in developing a psychological profile. While profiles cannot identify a specific individual, they can help investigators understand patterns of behavior. The offender was believed to be someone capable of blending into ordinary society while concealing violent sexual fantasies. He likely possessed enough confidence to approach a child without immediately causing alarm, yet enough caution to leave remarkably little evidence pointing toward his identity. The analysis suggested organization rather than impulse. April's body had been transported approximately 20 miles from the point of abduction before being abandoned along a rural roadway. That required planning, access to a vehicle, familiarity with the surrounding geography, and an understanding that distance complicated investigative efforts. Detectives studied maps repeatedly, identifying every possible route connecting Fort Wayne with the isolated location in DeKalb County where April's body had been discovered. They considered whether the killer lived near the disposal site, worked nearby, or simply selected an area he believed would delay discovery. Every road became significant. Every intersection raised new questions. Every mile represented another opportunity for the offender to make a mistake, but no mistake appeared. Meanwhile, forensic specialists continued extracting every possible clue from the preserved evidence. Hair fibers, biological samples, clothing, soil, vegetation, tire impressions. Everything collected during those first critical days underwent repeated examination as laboratory science improved throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. Investigators understood that physical evidence often outlasts memory. A witness may forget details after several years, but properly preserved evidence remains unchanged. Still, technology had limits. DNA testing was advancing, but national databases remained relatively small compared with later decades. Even if investigators possessed the offender's genetic profile, Identifying him required a comparison sample already existing within law enforcement records. If the killer had never been arrested for a qualifying offense, there would simply be no match. That possibility increasingly frustrated detectives. They possessed evidence pointing directly toward the unknown offender, yet lacked the technological bridge necessary to connect that evidence to a real person. Then the investigation took a deeply disturbing turn that transformed public anxiety into genuine fear. Around 1990 and 1991, several girls in Fort Wayne began discovering anonymous notes left on or near their bicycles. These were not childish pranks or meaningless graffiti. They were carefully written messages containing explicit threats and references to April Tinsley's murder. One message chillingly claimed that what had happened to April could happen again. Another suggested that the writer had intimate knowledge of the crime itself. Investigators immediately recognized the terrifying implication. If the author truly was the killer, he had not disappeared into history. He was still living within or near the same community, watching children, studying neighborhoods, and intentionally reigniting fear years after the murder. The notes instantly became some of the most valuable and unsettling pieces of evidence in the case. Every aspect underwent forensic examination. Detectives analyzed handwriting characteristics, spelling habits, grammatical patterns, punctuation, vocabulary, and sentence structure. Specialists evaluated whether the writing suggested a particular educational background, occupation, or age group. Fingerprints were sought. Trace evidence was collected from the paper itself. Nothing was considered insignificant. The wording of the notes suggested an offender who enjoyed psychological control as much as physical violence. Rather than remaining hidden, he appeared to derive satisfaction from reminding the community that he had escaped justice. The messages forced investigators to reconsider earlier assumptions. Was the offender attempting to relive the crime? Was he escalating toward another attack? Or was he simply feeding an overwhelming desire to dominate public attention while remaining anonymous? These questions influenced every strategic decision made by detectives. Police increased public awareness campaigns. Parents received renewed safety guidance. Schools encouraged children never to approach strangers or accept messages left near playgrounds or bicycles. Community meetings drew large crowds as frightened residents demanded answers that investigators simply did not possess. Despite these efforts, the anonymous communications stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Whether the offender became frightened by increased police attention or simply lost interest remains unknown. Investigators were left with additional evidence but still lacked the identity of the man behind both the murder and the threatening letters. Time continued moving forward. The early 1990s became the mid-1990s. Advances in forensic science accelerated across the United States. DNA profiling became increasingly reliable. National databases expanded through systems capable of comparing crime scene samples with convicted offenders. Every major cold case unit in America revisited unsolved murders involving preserved biological evidence, hoping modern laboratories might reveal answers impossible only a few years earlier. The April Tinsley investigation was no exception. Detectives repeatedly submitted evidence for new testing as techniques improved. Each examination confirmed the importance of the biological material recovered during the original investigation. The DNA profile remained consistent. It belonged to the unknown offender, yet every comparison against available databases produced the same disappointing result: no match. For investigators, those two words carried enormous weight. They did not mean the evidence was flawed. Quite the opposite. They meant the evidence was accurate, but the offender's DNA simply was not present in the system. Somewhere beyond law enforcement databases lived the individual whose genetic profile investigators could describe scientifically, yet whose name remained completely unknown. Cold case detectives often describe investigations as conversations across time. Every detective adds something to the file before passing it to the next generation. New technology asks new questions of old evidence. Fresh eyes notice overlooked details. Assumptions are challenged. In April Tinsley's case, every new detective inherited not only boxes filled with reports, but also the emotional responsibility of solving one of Indiana's most heartbreaking crimes. Many investigators developed deeply personal connections to the case despite never having met April herself. They studied family photographs showing a smiling second-grade girl whose future ended before it had truly begun. They interviewed original witnesses decades after the events, hoping memory might uncover one overlooked detail. They re-examined every suspect previously considered. Some individuals voluntarily provided DNA samples and were eliminated. Others became persons of interest before evidence ultimately excluded them. The list of investigated names grew steadily while the identity of the actual killer remained absent. Public interest fluctuated over the years. Every anniversary generated newspaper articles recalling the unsolved murder. Television stations interviewed retired detectives reflecting upon missed opportunities and enduring hope. Tip lines remained active. Occasionally, anonymous callers claimed knowledge of the crime. Some identified supposed suspects. Others offered elaborate theories unsupported by evidence. Detectives pursued each credible lead because experience had taught them that even unlikely information occasionally produced genuine breakthroughs. Yet every investigation ended in disappointment. The community gradually adapted to living alongside uncertainty. Children who had been warned about April's murder during elementary school grew into adults with families of their own. Some eventually explained the case to their own children as a cautionary reminder about personal safety. The murder became woven into local memory, not as a solved tragedy, but as an unanswered question that refused to disappear. For April's family, however, time did not soften the loss. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering served as another reminder of the life that had been stolen. While investigators focused upon evidence and procedure, the family carried something less measurable but equally enduring: the absence created by a child who never came home. Through interviews over the years, they continued expressing hope that the person responsible would eventually be identified. Advances in science encouraged cautious optimism, but optimism alone could not solve the case. Detectives needed something capable of accomplishing what fingerprints, eyewitness testimony, handwriting analysis, psychological profiling, and conventional DNA database searches had failed to do. They needed a method that did not require the killer to have been arrested before. At the time, such a method did not yet exist. But elsewhere, outside the traditional world of criminal investigation, millions of ordinary people were beginning to explore an entirely different use for DNA. Families curious about ancestry mailed saliva samples to private companies hoping to discover distant relatives, ethnic origins, and forgotten branches of family trees. Few imagined those recreational genealogy databases would eventually revolutionize homicide investigations. Fewer still realized that one of America's most haunting child murder cases was quietly waiting for precisely that scientific transformation. The evidence preserved in 1988 had survived decades without losing its value. Detectives had protected it through changing administrations, evolving forensic standards, and countless reviews because they believed one principle above all others: science never truly stands still. Someday, they hoped, the questions they could not answer would become questions that technology finally could. None of them could yet know that the breakthrough would come not from the killer himself, but from relatives who had never been suspected of any crime at all. The investigation survived because the evidence survived. That distinction became increasingly important as the calendar moved beyond the 20th anniversary of April Tinsley's murder. Many of the original detectives had retired. As some had passed away, witnesses had relocated across the country. Businesses that once stood along April's bicycle route had closed or changed ownership. Neighborhoods had evolved. Trees had grown taller. Streets had been repaved. Yet inside carefully controlled evidence storage rooms, sealed containers collected in April 1988 remained untouched by the passage of time. Those items represented more than physical exhibits. They represented possibility. Every improvement in forensic science gave investigators another reason to reopen the file, another opportunity to ask whether technology had finally become capable of answering questions that had once seemed impossible. By the early 2000s, DNA had transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Cases that had once depended almost entirely on eyewitness testimony were now being strengthened or overturned through genetic evidence. Hundreds of unidentified offenders were being connected to crimes through expanding national databases. Detectives assigned to April's case submitted evidence again as laboratory methods became more sensitive. Samples that had once required relatively large amounts of biological material could now be analyzed using only microscopic traces. Profiles became more complete. accuracy improved dramatically. Every advancement increased confidence that the offender's DNA profile was genuine. But confidence alone could not produce an arrest. Each comparison against the national offender database ended exactly the same way. No match. The repeated failures created a strange paradox. Investigators possessed extraordinarily reliable evidence pointing directly to the unknown killer, yet they remained unable to attach a name to that DNA profile. The offender had either never been convicted of an offense requiring DNA collection or had somehow remained outside every database available to law enforcement. That possibility forced detectives to reconsider the type of man they were searching for. Perhaps he was not a career criminal repeatedly cycling through the justice system. Perhaps he had lived a remarkably ordinary public life while concealing a horrific secret. Behavioral analysts revisited the case file with fresh eyes. The threatening notes left years after April's murder continued attracting particular attention because they revealed something deeply personal about the offender's psychology. Most killers work desperately to avoid attention after committing homicide. The author of these messages appeared to want the opposite. He wanted the community to remember. He wanted fear to remain alive. He wanted investigators to know they had failed. That behavior suggested confidence, perhaps even arrogance. Whoever wrote those notes believed he could communicate with the public without exposing himself. Investigators carefully compared the wording of every letter, searching for regional expressions, repeated spelling habits, unusual sentence construction, and recurring themes. Linguistic experts considered whether the author had military experience, higher education, technical training, or particular occupational habits reflected in his writing style. Every tiny detail became another fragment of an incomplete psychological portrait. The notes themselves were preserved just as carefully as every other piece of evidence. Advances in forensic technology meant investigators could now search for biological material invisible to earlier generations of scientists. Tiny skin cells deposited while sealing an envelope. Minute traces of saliva, microscopic DNA left simply by handling paper. Items once considered useless were suddenly capable of revealing astonishing amounts of information. Again, laboratories examined the evidence. Again, investigators hoped. Again, the answers proved incomplete. The DNA remained consistent. The offender remained anonymous. Meanwhile, the case continued affecting Fort Wayne in ways impossible to measure statistically. For families who had lived through April's disappearance, the memory never truly faded. Parents who had once organized neighborhood search parties were now grandparents. Former classmates had built careers and families while carrying memories of the frightened days when police officers visited schools asking questions about bicycles, strangers, and unfamiliar vehicles. Every anniversary served as another reminder that justice had not yet arrived. Law enforcement agencies refused to allow the investigation to disappear into storage. Cold case reviews became increasingly systematic. Detectives reconstructed the timeline from the beginning, deliberately questioning assumptions made decades earlier. Modern investigative philosophy recognizes that even excellent detectives can unknowingly develop tunnel vision during major cases. Reviewing old files with fresh perspectives occasionally uncovers overlooked possibilities. Every suspect identified during the original investigation underwent renewed evaluation. Every alibi received another look. Every forensic result was reinterpreted through modern scientific standards. Some individuals voluntarily provided DNA samples after renewed interviews. Others were quietly eliminated through evidence unavailable during the original investigation. The suspect list gradually narrowed. Yet the unknown offender remained outside every category investigators explored. National publicity occasionally revived public interest. Television documentaries, newspaper features, and true crime programs highlighted the case as one of Indiana's most frustrating unsolved child murders. Viewers called tip lines with theories ranging from plausible to wildly speculative. Detectives investigated every credible lead despite knowing that experience favored physical evidence over rumor. One lesson had become painfully clear after 2 decades. Memory weakens. Evidence does not. Around the same time, an entirely separate revolution was quietly unfolding beyond the walls of police departments. Commercial genetic genealogy began attracting millions of ordinary customers. People mailed saliva samples to private laboratories, hoping to discover family origins, connect with distant relatives, or answer long-standing questions about ancestry. Television advertisements encouraged curiosity about ethnic heritage. Family history became entertainment. Genealogical databases expanded at astonishing speed as consumers voluntarily uploaded their genetic information. Initially, few people inside law enforcement recognized the potential significance. These databases had not been created for criminal investigations. They existed to help families explore their personal histories. Yet some investigators began asking an extraordinary question. If unknown DNA from a crime scene could not identify the offender directly, could it identify someone biologically related to him? The idea sounded almost impossible. Instead of searching for one individual, investigators might search for cousins, second cousins, third cousins, relatives who had never committed crimes themselves but had unknowingly inherited pieces of the same genetic blueprint. The concept represented a fundamental shift in investigative thinking. Traditional DNA databases searched for exact matches. Genetic genealogy searched for family connections. It did not require the offender to have submitted DNA. It required someone biologically related to him to have done so. At first, the method remained experimental. Only a handful of investigators believed it could succeed. Questions surrounding privacy, legality, and scientific reliability generated considerable debate. Could family trees built from distant genetic relationships actually identify unknown killers? How many generations would investigators need to reconstruct? Could thousands of possible relatives eventually lead to one specific suspect? And no one knew. The methodology was still developing. Then, in 2018, another investigation changed everything. The identification and arrest of the individual known as the Golden State Killer demonstrated that investigative genetic genealogy could solve crimes that had remained unsolved for decades. By combining crime scene DNA with publicly available genealogy resources and painstaking family tree research, investigators identified a suspect who had eluded capture for more than 40 years. Across the United States, cold case units immediately took notice. Cases previously considered unsolvable suddenly looked different. Evidence that had waited patiently inside storage rooms for decades now possessed entirely new potential. Detectives in Indiana recognized the implications almost immediately. Among the first files demanding reconsideration stood one name: April Tinsley. The biological evidence collected in 1988 had been preserved with exceptional care. The DNA profile remained strong. The investigation had exhausted virtually every conventional avenue. If genetic genealogy could solve one of America's most notorious cold cases, perhaps it could answer the question that had haunted Fort Wayne since that spring afternoon in 1988. The decision marked one of the most significant turning points in the entire investigation. Instead of searching for suspects through interviews, criminal histories, or eyewitness accounts, investigators would begin searching through generations of family relationships. The strategy demanded extraordinary patience. Genealogists would need to build enormous family trees stretching backward through decades of births, marriages, deaths, census records, military records, newspaper archives, and public documents. Every branch had to be verified. Every relationship confirmed. One mistaken connection could send investigators toward the wrong family entirely. Unlike dramatic television portrayals, investigative genealogy is rarely fast. It is meticulous, painstaking, often involving months of research before a single name emerges. For the detectives assigned to April Tinsley's case, however, patience was nothing new. They had already waited nearly 30 years. If the answer truly lay hidden inside distant family trees, they were prepared to follow every branch until only one possibility remained. For the first time in decades, the investigation was no longer looking backward. It was finally beginning to move forward. The decision to pursue investigative genetic genealogy did not guarantee success. It simply opened a door that had never existed before. Detectives understood that they were entering unfamiliar territory, combining traditional homicide investigation with advanced genetics, historical research, and painstaking genealogical analysis. Unlike a fingerprint comparison, which can produce an immediate identification, this process would demand patience measured not in hours or days, but in weeks and months. Every result would need independent verification. Every family connection would have to withstand careful scrutiny. The stakes could not have been higher. After nearly 3 decades, investigators owed both April Tinsley's family and the public absolute certainty before accusing anyone of one of Indiana's most notorious child murders. The first step was ensuring that the biological evidence recovered in 1988 remained suitable for modern analysis. Fortunately, the investigators who had processed the original crime scene had preserved the evidence with remarkable care. Decisions made during those first difficult days, long before anyone imagined the future of forensic genetics, proved invaluable. Scientists extracted a DNA profile suitable for genealogical comparison, a process requiring extraordinary precision. Every laboratory procedure was carefully documented. Every result underwent quality control. Detectives knew the investigation could not afford shortcuts. The credibility of everything that followed depended on the integrity of the science. Rather than searching for an exact match in a criminal database, forensic specialists began looking for partial genetic relationships through genealogy resources that permitted law enforcement use under their policies at the time. The results were both encouraging and frustrating. There was no close relative waiting to identify the killer immediately. Instead, there were distant genetic connections, people who shared small portions of DNA with the unknown offender. Individually, these matches meant very little. Collectively, they formed the beginning of an enormous puzzle. Professional genealogists now entered the investigation alongside homicide detectives. Their work looked nothing like conventional police procedure. Instead of interrogations and surveillance, they spent countless hours examining historical records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, census documents, military records, property records, newspaper archives, church registries. Every document helped construct sprawling family trees extending across multiple generations. The objective was deceptively simple: identify the common ancestors shared by the distant DNA matches, then follow every descendant forward through time until the unknown offender could be isolated. In reality, the work was extraordinarily complex. One ancestral couple might have produced dozens of descendants over several generations. Those descendants spread across different states, changed surnames through marriage, served in the military, relocated for employment, and built families of their own. Every branch required verification. Every relationship demanded documentation. Investigators could not rely on assumptions. They needed evidence supporting every connection. Weeks became months. Gradually, the enormous family tree narrowed. Certain branches no longer fit the available evidence. Some descendants were excluded because of age. Others had died before April's murder. Some lived thousands of miles away with no apparent connection to Indiana. Little by little, the overwhelming number of possibilities became increasingly manageable. Meanwhile, detectives returned to traditional investigative methods. The genealogical research produced names, but names alone were not enough. Investigators compared ages, employment histories, residential records, driver's license information, and known addresses. They asked practical questions. Who lived near Fort Wayne in 1988? Who had access to transportation consistent with the circumstances of the crime? Who fit the behavioral profile developed years earlier? Who could reasonably have written the threatening notes that terrorized local children after April's murder? The process slowly directed attention toward one individual, John D. Miller. At first glance, there appeared to be nothing extraordinary about him. He had spent years living an outwardly ordinary life in Indiana. Neighbors generally did not describe him as someone who attracted constant police attention. There was no public reputation linking him to one of the state's most infamous cold cases. Like many offenders who avoid detection for decades, he blended into everyday society with unsettling effectiveness. But investigators understood a critical principle. And genealogy identifies possibilities. Evidence establishes guilt. No matter how compelling the family tree analysis appeared, detectives still required direct forensic confirmation. They needed Miller's DNA. Obtaining that confirmation demanded careful planning. Investigators could not simply compel a DNA sample without satisfying legal requirements. Instead, they initiated discreet surveillance. Detectives observed Miller's movements while taking great care not to alert him. If he realized he had become a suspect, He might alter his routine, destroy potential evidence, or create unnecessary complications. Surveillance teams watched patiently. They documented daily habits. They noted where he traveled, where he stopped, and how he disposed of ordinary household items. Eventually, investigators collected DNA from an item Miller had discarded in public, allowing forensic scientists to compare that sample with the biological evidence preserved from April's murder. The laboratory comparison represented one of the most anticipated moments in the entire investigation. Nearly 30 years had passed since April disappeared. Thousands of investigative hours had been invested. Generations of detectives had contributed to the case. Now everything depended upon one scientific comparison. When the results arrived, they were unequivocal. The DNA recovered from Miller matched the DNA preserved from the crime scene. The unknown genetic profile that had haunted investigators since 1988 finally belonged to a real person. For detectives who had dedicated years of their careers to the investigation, the moment carried enormous emotional significance. Some later described a profound mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Satisfaction because science had finally answered the central question of the investigation. Sorrow because the answer arrived far too late for April herself and after decades of pain endured by her family. Yet experienced investigators understood something equally important. A DNA match, while extraordinarily powerful, marked the beginning of the final phase, not the end. Every aspect of the case still required careful preparation before an arrest. Detectives reviewed decades of investigative files one final time. They reconstructed the timeline from beginning to end. They re-examined witness interviews. They organized forensic reports. They prepared search warrants and arrest documentation. Prosecutors worked closely with investigators to ensure every element of the case could withstand intense courtroom scrutiny. The threatening notes also returned to the center of attention. Investigators compared handwriting samples associated with Miller to the anonymous communications collected years earlier. Although DNA had become the cornerstone of the investigation, every additional piece of corroborating evidence strengthened the overall case. Detectives sought not merely to identify the offender, but to demonstrate the complete narrative of his actions before and after April's murder. By this stage, the atmosphere inside the investigation had changed dramatically. For decades, every new lead carried uncertainty. Now uncertainty had largely been replaced by verification. The evidence was converging from multiple directions: forensic science, genealogical research, traditional investigative work. Each independent discipline pointed toward the same individual. Still, secrecy remained essential. Very few people knew how close investigators had come to solving one of Indiana's longest-running cold cases. Outside law enforcement, life continued normally. Inside the investigative team, however, preparations accelerated. Detectives understood they were approaching a moment many had once believed impossible. The man who had remained anonymous through changing presidents, evolving technology, and nearly 30 years of investigation was about to lose the protection of anonymity forever. The same DNA that had silently waited inside evidence storage since April 1988 had finally spoken. And this time, it had spoken with absolute clarity. The morning investigators moved to confront John D. Miller marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For nearly 30 years, his identity had existed only as an unknown DNA profile stored inside forensic databases and evidence files. Detectives had referred to him as an unidentified offender, an unknown male, a genetic signature without a face. Now, after decades of unanswered questions, that signature belonged to a living person. Every step leading to his arrest had been planned with extraordinary care. There would be no dramatic chase through city streets, no armed standoff broadcast live on television. The investigation had reached this point through patience, documentation, and science. Detectives intended to finish it the same way. By the time officers approached Miller, prosecutors had assembled a case built upon multiple layers of evidence. At its center stood the DNA comparison, linking him to biological evidence preserved from April Tinsley's murder in 1988. Surrounding that scientific foundation were decades of investigative work, the chronology of the original crime, the threatening notes that had terrorized children in Fort Wayne years afterward, and the painstaking genealogical research that had led investigators to his name in the first place. No single element stood alone. Together, they formed a coherent picture that investigators believed would withstand the scrutiny of court proceedings. The arrest itself sent shockwaves through Indiana. For almost 3 decades, the murder of April Tinsley had represented one of the state's most painful unsolved crimes. Entire generations had grown up hearing her name associated with the words cold case. Parents had warned their children about the investigation. Detectives had spent careers wondering whether they would ever identify the man responsible. Then, almost overnight, headlines changed. The case was no longer unsolved. The unknown killer had a name. News organizations descended upon Fort Wayne almost immediately. Reporters revisited neighborhoods where April had ridden her bicycle. Cameras filmed the streets that had become synonymous with the tragedy. Former investigators, many now retired, were interviewed about the breakthrough. Some admitted they had never expected to see the case solved during their lifetimes. Others described the arrest as proof that preserving evidence, even when immediate answers seem impossible, can eventually deliver justice decades later. For April's family, however, the emotions were more complicated than celebration. Justice had finally moved forward. Closure remained far more difficult. No arrest could restore the years that had been stolen. No courtroom proceeding could return the childhood that ended on April 1st, SIL, 1988. Family members had lived through birthdays, holidays, graduations, weddings, and countless ordinary moments where April's absence remained painfully visible. The arrest answered the question of who. It could never erase the reality of what had happened. Investigators also reflected upon the extraordinary role played by the detectives who had worked the case long before genetic genealogy existed. Those first officers arriving at the crime scene in 1988 could not have imagined the forensic capabilities available 30 years later, yet they understood one timeless principle: preserve everything. Because they carefully collected and stored biological evidence, later generations inherited material capable of benefiting from scientific advances no one could have predicted. The breakthrough also transformed discussions throughout the law enforcement community. Investigative genetic genealogy had already demonstrated its potential in other high-profile cases, but April Tinsley's murder became another powerful example of what could happen when traditional detective work merged with modern science. Police agencies across the United States began reviewing additional cold cases involving preserved biological evidence. Investigators who had nearly exhausted conventional methods suddenly recognized new possibilities. The lesson extended beyond technology. Cold cases are often described as investigations suspended in time. In reality, they continue evolving. Evidence remains. Science advances. Methods improve. What appears impossible in one decade may become routine in the next. That philosophy had sustained detectives assigned to April's case through years of disappointment. Every failed DNA comparison, every unproductive interview, every dead-end lead could easily have encouraged investigators to abandon hope. Instead, successive generations of detectives continued reopening the file, convinced that future technology might answer questions the present could not. Their persistence proved justified. As the criminal case proceeded, prosecutors carefully presented the evidence linking Miller to the murder. Public reporting focused heavily on the DNA match and the genealogical investigation that identified him as a suspect. The case also renewed public attention to the threatening notes that had appeared years after April's death. Those messages, remembered vividly by many Fort Wayne residents, had amplified fear throughout the community and remained among the most disturbing aspects of the investigation. The prosecution did not rely on speculation. It relied on evidence. Every forensic result underwent review. Every laboratory procedure was documented. Every investigative decision became part of the official record. This methodical approach reflected the reality that major criminal cases are built not upon dramatic moments, but upon countless verified facts assembled piece by piece. Eventually, Miller admitted responsibility for the murder. His guilty plea meant that the case concluded without the uncertainty of a lengthy trial, sparing April's family from hearing every painful detail debated before a jury. In 2020, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison. For investigators, the conclusion carried a profound sense of accountability fulfilled. Many of the officers who had first searched for April never had the opportunity to witness the final resolution. Some had retired decades earlier. Others had passed away before the arrest occurred, yet their work remained present in every courtroom document, every forensic report, and every preserved piece of evidence. The successful prosecution belonged not only to the detectives who made the arrest, but also to those who had refused to let the case disappear into forgotten archives. The story of April Tinsley's murder ultimately became more than the story of one investigation. It became a reminder of how dramatically criminal investigations can change across generations. In 1988, detectives depended largely on eyewitness accounts, physical searches, interviews, and conventional forensic methods. By 2018, investigators could combine DNA science with genealogical research spanning centuries of family history. The distance between those two worlds represented one of the greatest transformations in modern law enforcement. For the public, the case also challenged a long-held assumption. Many believed that if a killer escaped capture for decades, he had effectively escaped forever. April Tinsley's case proved otherwise. Time does not necessarily weaken evidence. Sometimes it strengthens it. As technology evolves, evidence preserved decades earlier may reveal answers that were invisible when the crime occurred. Today, April Tinsley's name remains associated not only with tragedy, but also with perseverance. Her case is studied by investigators, forensic scientists, and legal professionals as an example of why cold cases deserve continued attention. It demonstrates the importance of meticulous evidence preservation, interdisciplinary cooperation, and the willingness to revisit investigations once considered unsolvable. The investigation that began with the disappearance of an 8-year-old girl on an ordinary spring afternoon lasted nearly 30 years. It passed from one generation of detectives to the next, surviving changing technology, changing leadership, and changing investigative methods. Throughout that time, one constant remained. The evidence waited. It did not forget. And when science finally caught up with the truth, it revealed what decades of determination had been searching for all along. The man who believed he had disappeared into history had not escaped justice. He had merely outrun the science of his own era. Eventually, that science caught up. And when it did, one of Indiana's longest-running cold cases finally came to an end, not through luck, not through coincidence, but through the relentless combination of careful police work, preserved evidence, and the extraordinary power of modern forensic genetics. Although the criminal investigation had reached its conclusion, the legacy of the April Tinsley case was only beginning to unfold. Across the United States, detectives responsible for unsolved homicides studied the investigation with remarkable attention. For years, cold case units had been forced to balance limited resources against thousands of unsolved murders, many dating back decades. Investigators often faced the same heartbreaking dilemma. They believed the evidence still held the answer, but the available technology simply could not reveal it. April Tinsley's case demonstrated that this assumption was no longer true. A file that had remained open for nearly 30 years was not solved because someone suddenly remembered a forgotten detail or because a witness finally came forward. It was solved because evidence collected in 1988 was preserved well enough to benefit from scientific methods that did not yet exist when the crime occurred. Within law enforcement agencies, the case became an important example of the value of evidence preservation. Detectives frequently pointed to the decisions made during the original investigation. Crime scene technicians had carefully collected biological evidence despite having no realistic expectation that it could immediately identify the offender. They followed procedure, documented every item, maintained the chain of custody, and ensured that nothing was discarded simply because contemporary science had reached its limits. Those seemingly routine decisions became the foundation upon which the entire future investigation rested. For forensic scientists, the case illustrated another important lesson. Technology rarely advances all at once. Instead, progress occurs through countless small improvements. DNA profiling became more sensitive. Laboratory contamination controls improved. Computational analysis became faster. Genealogical databases expanded dramatically. Public records became increasingly digitized. Each advancement alone represented only a modest improvement. Together, they transformed investigations once considered impossible. The success of the investigation also renewed discussions about investigative persistence. Cold cases are often misunderstood by the public. Once media attention fades, many people assume detectives simply stop working. In reality, most major cold cases continue receiving periodic review whenever new evidence, new technology, or new investigative strategies become available. Detectives assigned to these cases understand that solving an old homicide frequently depends upon recognizing opportunities unavailable to previous generations. That philosophy guided every stage of the April Tinsley investigation. The original detectives focused upon preserving evidence. Later investigators embraced improved DNA testing. Still later, specialists incorporated investigative genetic genealogy. Each generation contributed something different. No single detective solved the case alone. Rather, the investigation represented the accumulated work of dozens of professionals across nearly 3 decades. The story also became a reminder of how offenders sometimes misunderstand the passage of time. Many criminals believe that surviving the first few months or years after a homicide dramatically reduces the likelihood of arrest. Historically, there was some truth to that assumption. The witnesses moved away. Physical evidence deteriorated. Memories faded. Investigative priorities shifted. But modern forensic science has altered that equation. Properly preserved biological evidence does not become less valuable simply because years have passed. In many cases, it becomes more valuable as technology improves. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrated exactly that principle. The offender did not evade justice because investigators lacked evidence. He evaded justice because science required time to catch up. When it finally did, decades of anonymity disappeared almost immediately. Another lasting impact involved public awareness of investigative genetic genealogy itself. Before several high-profile cases demonstrated its effectiveness, relatively few people outside forensic science understood how the method worked. Some mistakenly believed investigators could identify anyone simply by possessing crime scene DNA. The reality proved more complex. Genealogy did not magically identify the offender. It generated investigative leads. Professional genealogists then spent months reconstructing extensive family histories before detectives narrowed their focus to one individual. Traditional police work remained essential throughout the process. Surveillance. Background investigations. Collection of a discarded DNA sample. Laboratory confirmation. Legal review. Every step followed established investigative procedures. The genealogy merely pointed investigators in the correct direction. The final identification still depended upon conventional forensic evidence. The case also reinforced the importance of interdisciplinary cooperation. Modern homicide investigations increasingly involve experts from multiple fields. And crime scene specialists, forensic biologists, DNA analysts, genealogists, behavioral analysts, digital forensic specialists, prosecutors, traditional detectives. Each discipline contributes a different perspective. The April Tinsley investigation succeeded because those perspectives complemented rather than replaced one another. For the community of Fort Wayne, the resolution marked the end of one of the city's longest periods of unanswered grief. Residents who had lived under the shadow of the unsolved murder finally received confirmation that the man responsible had been identified and convicted. While no outcome could erase the tragedy, the arrest removed the uncertainty that had persisted across generations. Community members who had participated in the original searches reflected upon how deeply the crime had influenced everyday life. Parents recalled changing household routines, establishing stricter rules for children, and viewing neighborhood safety differently after April's disappearance. Teachers remembered comforting frightened students. Police officers who had once searched wooded areas and roadside ditches remembered the emotional weight carried by every unanswered lead. The investigation had become part of local history. Its resolution became equally significant. For April's family, public attention gradually shifted from the mystery itself toward remembrance. Rather than asking who committed the crime, people increasingly focused upon April's life. Family photographs, school memories, stories shared by those who knew her. The investigation had finally restored one important truth. April would no longer be remembered only as the victim in an unsolved case. The identity of the offender no longer overshadowed her name. Justice, though delayed, had finally established accountability. Looking back across the full investigation, one fact stands above all others. Nothing about the outcome happened quickly. Every breakthrough rested upon years of patient work. Every scientific advance built upon previous discoveries. Every detective inherited responsibilities from investigators who came before. The solution emerged not through dramatic coincidence, but through persistence extending across generations. Today, criminal justice professionals frequently reference the April Tinsley investigation when discussing the future of cold case investigations. It serves as an example of how evidence preservation, scientific innovation, and institutional determination can converge decades after a crime occurs. It also reminds investigators that the passage of time should never be mistaken for the disappearance of truth. Truth often waits. Sometimes it waits for better questions. Sometimes it waits for better technology. Sometimes it waits for people willing to reopen forgotten files and challenge assumptions accepted years earlier. The investigation into April Tinsley's murder embodies all three. Nearly 30 years separated the crime from the identification of the offender. Yet throughout those decades, one quiet certainty remained inside an evidence locker. The answer had been there from the beginning, and science simply needed enough time to recognize it. That realization continues influencing homicide investigations across the world, encouraging detectives to preserve evidence meticulously, revisit cold cases regularly, and remember that justice is not always measured by speed. Sometimes justice is measured by persistence. And sometimes, even after nearly 3 decades of silence, persistence is enough to ensure that the truth is finally heard. If there is one enduring lesson from the murder of April Tinsley, it is that justice is rarely the result of a single breakthrough. Public attention often focuses on the dramatic moment of an arrest, the headline announcing that a decades-old mystery has finally been solved, or the courtroom where a guilty plea brings a long investigation to its legal conclusion. Those moments are important, but they represent only the final pages of a story that has often been unfolding for years or even decades. Behind every solved cold case stands an extraordinary accumulation of quiet decisions, careful procedures, and unwavering commitment by people whose names rarely appear in news reports. The April Tinsley investigation became one of the clearest examples of that reality. One of the most remarkable aspects of the case was not simply that it was solved after nearly 30 years, but that it remained solvable at all. Thousands of criminal investigations eventually reach a point where physical evidence has been lost, improperly stored, contaminated, or destroyed. Once that happens, even the most advanced forensic technology cannot recover what no longer exists. In April's case, investigators in 1988 treated every piece of evidence as though it might one day become essential, despite having no way to predict the scientific developments that would emerge decades later. That foresight was not based on extraordinary prediction. It was based on professional discipline. Crime scene investigators followed established procedures. Evidence technicians documented every transfer. Laboratory personnel maintained strict preservation standards. Property custodians ensured that evidence remained secure through changing administrations and evolving forensic practices. The chain of custody never became merely paperwork. It became the invisible thread connecting 1988 to 2018. Throughout those 3 decades, countless individuals handled the case file without knowing whether their work would ever produce an arrest. Detectives came and went. Supervisors retired. Prosecutors changed. Forensic laboratories modernized. Yet every new investigator inherited the same responsibility: continue protecting the evidence, continue reviewing the facts, and continue believing that future opportunities might emerge. That philosophy distinguishes successful cold case investigations from those that disappear into forgotten archives. Experienced investigators understand that unsolved does not necessarily mean unsolvable. It often means unsolved for now. The phrase "for now" became increasingly important as forensic science evolved. By the early 21st century, investigators were no longer limited to asking whether crime scene DNA matched someone already inside a criminal database. They could begin asking broader questions about biological relationships, ancestry, and inherited genetic patterns. Investigative genetic genealogy fundamentally changed the direction of many cold case investigations because it replaced one impossible question: who is this unknown DNA profile? with a more practical one. Who are this person's relatives? The distinction proved revolutionary. Rather than searching for one invisible individual, investigators searched for families, family trees, historical records, generations of documented relationships. Every branch narrowed the possibilities. Every confirmed ancestor reduced uncertainty. Every verified descendant brought detectives closer to the truth. The genealogy itself, however, never replaced traditional detective work. Once genealogists identified potential family lines, experienced investigators resumed familiar responsibilities. They compared addresses, employment histories, vehicle ownership records, age, geographic proximity, known movements, behavioral characteristics. Nothing about the investigation abandoned conventional police work. Instead, modern science and traditional investigation strengthened one another. The April Tinsley case also highlighted another often overlooked reality of homicide investigations. Most major breakthroughs occur quietly. Television dramas frequently portray detectives experiencing sudden revelations after dramatic interrogations or emotional confessions. Real investigations are usually far less theatrical. A laboratory report arrives. A family tree eliminates another branch. A surveillance operation confirms routine behavior. A DNA comparison produces a match. Each step appears almost ordinary when viewed independently. Collectively, they become extraordinary. For prosecutors, the case demonstrated the importance of presenting scientific evidence in a manner understandable to juries and the public. Genetic genealogy itself did not establish legal guilt. Rather, it served as an investigative method that directed detectives toward a suspect. The decisive forensic evidence came from the direct DNA comparison linking John D. Miller to biological material preserved from the crime scene. That distinction remains important because it illustrates how emerging investigative techniques complement, not replace established legal standards. The investigation also prompted broader conversations about ethics and privacy. As investigative genetic genealogy gained national attention, legal experts, scientists, and policymakers examined appropriate safeguards governing its use. Questions arose concerning consent, public genealogy databases, and the balance between solving violent crimes and protecting individual privacy. Those discussions continue today, shaping policies that seek to preserve both public safety and civil liberties. Within law enforcement, however, one conclusion attracted widespread agreement. When used responsibly and within applicable legal and policy frameworks, investigative genetic genealogy had become one of the most significant advances in modern criminal investigation. Its impact extended far beyond April Tinsley's case. Across the country, agencies reopened unsolved homicides involving preserved biological evidence. Victims whose families had waited decades for answers suddenly found renewed hope. Investigators who had once believed certain files would never be solved began requesting fresh forensic reviews. Some cases produced immediate results. Others remain under active investigation. Many more continue waiting for additional scientific advances. The story of April Tinsley also changed public perception of cold cases themselves. For many years, people tended to view unsolved murders as permanent mysteries. If enough time passed, the assumption was that justice had slipped away forever. This investigation challenged that belief directly. And time had not protected the offender. Time had strengthened the investigation. Every improvement in forensic genetics increased the value of evidence preserved decades earlier. Ironically, the very years that seemed to separate investigators from the truth eventually brought them closer to it. There is another aspect of the case that deserves equal attention: the role of persistence. And persistence is rarely dramatic. It does not produce immediate headlines. It often consists of reopening files that have already been reviewed dozens of times, reading reports again, submitting evidence for another laboratory examination, calling witnesses whose memories may have faded, reviewing technological developments to determine whether old evidence deserves new testing. Most of these efforts produce no immediate breakthrough. Some produce none at all. Yet without persistence, breakthroughs become impossible. The detectives who finally solved April Tinsley's murder inherited an investigation built upon thousands of hours of work completed by others. Likewise, future investigators will inherit cases currently awaiting scientific advances that have not yet been imagined. That continuity represents one of the defining characteristics of professional criminal investigation. Every generation builds upon the previous one. Every solved case strengthens future investigations. Every scientific advancement expands the possibilities available to those who continue searching for answers. Today, April Tinsley's case occupies an important place in the history of forensic investigation. It is remembered not only because an 8-year-old girl lost her life in a heartbreaking act of violence, but because her case demonstrated what becomes possible when evidence is preserved, investigators refuse to surrender, and science continues moving forward. The investigation began with an ordinary bicycle ride on a quiet Indiana afternoon. It evolved into one of the state's longest-running cold cases. It concluded through a combination of meticulous police work, forensic genetics, genealogical research, and decades of determination. Its legacy continues influencing homicide investigations around the world. For detectives, it reinforced a simple but profound principle: never underestimate evidence. Never assume technology has reached its final destination. And never mistake the passage of time for the disappearance of truth. Because sometimes the truth is not lost. Sometimes it is simply waiting for the future to find it. The resolution of the April Tinsley investigation reached far beyond a single courtroom or a single conviction. In the years that followed, law enforcement agencies across the United States increasingly viewed the case as a practical demonstration of what modern forensic science could accomplish when combined with decades of careful investigative work. Detectives who specialized in cold cases often described it as a reminder that every unsolved homicide deserved periodic re-examination. The passage of time was no longer viewed solely as an obstacle. In many investigations, time had become an unexpected ally, allowing scientific innovation to reveal answers that had once been permanently hidden. Cold case units began conducting systematic reviews of older investigations involving preserved biological evidence. Shelves containing forgotten evidence boxes suddenly attracted renewed attention. Detectives reopened files that had not been actively investigated for years. Every preserved DNA sample represented a potential opportunity. Every unsolved homicide became a question worth asking again. Could today's science accomplish what yesterday's science could not? Forensic laboratories experienced similar changes. Technological improvements continued at an extraordinary pace. DNA sequencing became faster. Computational analysis became increasingly sophisticated. Methods requiring only minute quantities of biological material expanded investigative possibilities even further. Cases previously considered unsuitable for advanced analysis occasionally became viable simply because laboratories could now recover useful information from evidence once regarded as too limited or too degraded. The April Tinsley investigation became part of that broader transformation. Training programs for detectives and forensic professionals frequently reference the case when discussing evidence preservation. Crime scene investigators emphasize that no one can accurately predict which scientific techniques will exist 20 or 30 years in the future. The safest assumption is that future investigators will possess capabilities beyond those currently available. Consequently, every item collected at a homicide scene deserves careful preservation, even when its immediate value appears uncertain. This philosophy represents one of the most significant cultural changes within modern forensic investigation. Evidence is no longer collected solely for today's laboratories. It is collected for tomorrow's as well. The investigation also reinforced another important principle. Cold casework demands humility. Every generation of investigators must recognize that future professionals may possess tools unavailable today. Detectives solving crimes in the 1980s could not reasonably anticipate investigative genetic genealogy. Likewise, investigators working today acknowledge that future forensic methods may eventually solve cases still considered impossible. That perspective encourages continuous review rather than permanent closure. An unsolved investigation is not necessarily finished. It is simply waiting. The emotional impact of the case remained equally significant. For April Tinsley's family, the legal conclusion could never erase decades of grief. Yet accountability matters. Identifying the offender ended years of uncertainty, and confirmed that investigators had never abandoned the search for answers. Families of homicide victims frequently describe uncertainty as one of the most difficult burdens to endure. Knowing that a loved one has been murdered is devastating. Not knowing who committed the crime or whether justice will ever arrive adds another layer of suffering. Identification and conviction of the offender removed that uncertainty. It established responsibility. It allowed history to record the truth based upon evidence rather than unanswered questions. For the broader Fort Wayne community, the resolution carried symbolic importance as well. Residents who remembered the fear surrounding April's disappearance often reflected upon how profoundly the murder had altered daily life. Parents who had once allowed children considerable independence recalled becoming far more cautious afterward. Neighborhood routines changed. Conversations about child safety became more frequent. Schools incorporated additional safety guidance into educational programs. The murder became one of those defining community events remembered decades later by people who had lived through it. When the case was finally solved, many residents experienced a sense of collective relief. Not because the tragedy had disappeared, because the unanswered question had. Communities often struggle with unresolved violent crimes because uncertainty lingers indefinitely. Every rumor, every anniversary, every speculative theory reopens old wounds. A verified investigative conclusion cannot undo the past, but it can replace speculation with established fact. Within forensic science, April Tinsley's case continues illustrating the extraordinary value of interdisciplinary cooperation. No single discipline solved the investigation independently. Crime scene specialists preserved the evidence. Laboratory scientists developed reliable DNA profiles. Genealogists reconstructed family histories. Detectives conducted surveillance and traditional investigative work. The prosecutors assembled the legal case. Each contribution depended upon the others. Modern homicide investigations increasingly operate through exactly this kind of collaboration. Scientific innovation has expanded investigative possibilities, but successful prosecutions still require meticulous documentation, careful legal procedure, and rigorous verification. The investigation also demonstrated that sophisticated technology does not eliminate the importance of patience. Genealogical research required months of painstaking work. Historical records had to be verified. Family relationships had to be documented accurately. Potential suspects had to be eliminated methodically. Laboratory results required independent confirmation. Every stage demanded precision. Rushing any portion of the investigation risked compromising its credibility. Patience remained as essential in 2018 as it had been in 1988. Looking back across the full chronology of the case, one observation becomes impossible to ignore. The investigation succeeded because each generation respected the work completed by those who came before. Original detectives documented the crime thoroughly. Evidence custodians preserved critical materials. Successive investigators refused to abandon the case. Scientists continually reevaluated preserved evidence using improved methods. No generation viewed itself as working alone. Each inherited responsibility from the previous one. Each prepared the investigation for the next. That continuity represents one of the defining strengths of professional criminal investigation. Justice is often cumulative. Every report, every photograph, every laboratory submission, every carefully labeled evidence package, every documented interview, all become part of an investigation capable of surviving decades. The murder of April Tinsley therefore occupies an important place not only in Indiana's criminal history, but also in the broader evolution of forensic investigation. It reminds investigators that science and persistence frequently accomplish together what neither could achieve independently. And perhaps the most powerful lesson is also the simplest. Criminal investigations do not end when headlines disappear. They continue quietly inside evidence rooms, forensic laboratories, detective bureaus, and cold case units where professionals remain committed to answering questions that others may have forgotten. Sometimes those answers emerge quickly. Sometimes they require 30 years. The length of time matters far less than the commitment to continue searching. Because evidence has no expiration date on truth, it waits patiently. It preserves its secrets. And when the right combination of science, determination, and opportunity finally arrives, those secrets can still speak with remarkable clarity. That is the enduring legacy of April Tinsley's case. Not merely that a decades-old murder was solved, but that the investigation proved an enduring principle of modern criminal justice. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it is simply justice waiting for the future. The story of April Tinsley's murder is often remembered for its remarkable forensic breakthrough, but its deeper significance lies in what it revealed about the evolution of criminal investigations themselves. In 1988, detectives were confronting a crime with the best resources available at the time. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, searched neighborhoods, examined vehicles, followed anonymous tips, and relied upon forensic methods that represented the cutting edge of that era. None of those investigators lacked determination. What they lacked was technology capable of extracting every answer hidden inside the evidence they had so carefully collected. Their experience illustrates a reality familiar to every homicide investigator. Solving a crime depends not only on skill and persistence, but also on the scientific tools available at the moment the investigation unfolds. The decades separating April's murder from the eventual identification of the offender transformed nearly every aspect of forensic science. DNA profiling became increasingly precise. Laboratory procedures reduced contamination risks. Digital record systems improved evidence management. Public records became more accessible through electronic archives. At the same time, entirely new investigative disciplines emerged, including the development of investigative genetic genealogy. None of these changes occurred overnight. They resulted from years of scientific research, legal refinement, technological innovation, and collaboration between forensic laboratories, academic researchers, and law enforcement agencies. One of the most remarkable features of the April Tinsley investigation is how seamlessly old evidence became compatible with new science. The biological material recovered in 1988 never changed. The questions investigators could ask of that evidence did. That distinction is critical. Evidence itself often remains constant. Human knowledge evolves. Every scientific advance expands the number of questions investigators are capable of asking. For decades, detectives repeatedly asked one question: does this DNA belong to someone already known to law enforcement? The answer remained no. Investigative genetic genealogy allowed investigators to ask a completely different question. Who is biologically related to the person who left this DNA? That single shift in perspective transformed an investigation that had appeared stalled into one moving steadily toward resolution. The case also demonstrated that successful investigations rarely depend upon dramatic moments of intuition. Popular culture frequently portrays detectives solving crimes through sudden inspiration or fortunate coincidence. The reality documented in April Tinsley's investigation was considerably different. Progress emerged through disciplined procedure, repeated verification, and the willingness to examine evidence again whenever scientific capabilities improved. Every laboratory result required confirmation. Every genealogical connection required documentation. Every investigative conclusion required supporting evidence. Nothing rested upon speculation. Everything rested upon facts capable of independent verification. This methodical approach ultimately strengthened the legal case. When prosecutors presented the evidence against John D. Miller, the investigation had already survived years of scientific review and careful scrutiny. The DNA evidence had been examined repeatedly using increasingly sophisticated methods. Genealogical research had directed investigators toward Miller, but the decisive forensic comparison came from a direct DNA match between him and the biological evidence preserved from the crime scene. This distinction remains important because it demonstrates how innovative investigative techniques function within established legal standards rather than replacing them. The case also encouraged broader discussions regarding long-term evidence management. Across the United States, police agencies began reassessing how biological evidence should be preserved in unsolved violent crimes. Investigators recognized that future scientific developments might require access to materials currently considered insignificant. As a result, many departments reviewed storage procedures, documentation standards, and policies governing the retention of evidence from homicide investigations. These procedural improvements may never appear in newspaper headlines, yet they represent one of the investigation's most enduring contributions. Every carefully preserved evidence package increases the possibility that future investigators will possess opportunities unavailable today. The influence of the case extended beyond homicide investigations. Universities incorporated discussions of investigative genetic genealogy into forensic science curricula. Professional conferences examined the investigative strategies employed throughout the case. Legal scholars analyzed the emerging relationship between genealogy, privacy considerations, and criminal investigations. Forensic laboratories refined procedures governing genealogical analysis. Each discussion reflected the same underlying reality. The April Tinsley investigation had become more than a solved murder. It had become an educational case study. Another important aspect of the investigation involved institutional continuity. Cold cases frequently survive multiple generations of investigators. Personnel retire. Supervisors change. Laboratories modernize. Technology evolves. Without careful documentation, valuable knowledge can easily disappear. The April Tinsley case demonstrated the importance of maintaining comprehensive investigative records capable of guiding future detectives long after the original investigators leave the profession. Every interview summary, every crime scene diagram, every laboratory report, every evidence inventory. Together, they created an investigative history that remained understandable decades later. Future detectives did not inherit confusion. They inherited organization. That organization allowed them to integrate modern forensic techniques without repeating years of earlier investigative work. The human dimension of the investigation remained equally significant. Behind every laboratory report stood the memory of an 8-year-old child whose life ended far too soon. For April's family, the passage of time never diminished the loss. Birthdays continued arriving. Family milestones continued passing. Photographs remained frozen in childhood while years accumulated around them. The legal resolution could never restore what had been taken. It could, however, establish accountability based upon evidence rather than uncertainty. For investigators, that distinction matters profoundly. Justice cannot erase tragedy. It can acknowledge truth. The investigation also challenged assumptions regarding offender behavior. Many violent offenders believe that avoiding identification during the initial stages of an investigation dramatically reduces the likelihood of future arrest. Historically, advancing years often benefited offenders because witnesses forgot details and forensic limitations restricted investigative options. Modern forensic science has altered that calculation. Evidence preserved today may become substantially more informative tomorrow. The passage of time no longer guarantees safety from identification. In some cases, it increases the likelihood that scientific innovation will eventually reveal the truth. That lesson continues influencing criminal investigations throughout the world. Detectives approaching contemporary cold cases frequently ask a question that previous generations could not. What future technology might reveal answers currently beyond our reach? The answer remains unknown. History suggests that future investigators will possess capabilities difficult to imagine today. Exactly as investigators in 1988 could not foresee investigative genetic genealogy. Exactly as earlier generations could not anticipate modern DNA profiling. Scientific progress consistently expands investigative possibilities. The April Tinsley investigation, therefore, stands as both a conclusion and a beginning. It concluded one of Indiana's longest-running homicide investigations. It simultaneously opened new possibilities for countless others. Every cold case detective understands that unresolved investigations represent unfinished conversations between evidence and science. Sometimes science requires decades to catch up. Sometimes evidence waits patiently until the necessary questions can finally be asked. April Tinsley's case proved that waiting can matter. Not because justice delayed becomes easier. Because persistence ensures that when opportunity finally arrives, investigators remain prepared to recognize it. The evidence collected in 1988 never forgot. The detectives who inherited the case never abandoned it. And the scientific community never stopped advancing. Together, those three forces accomplished something once considered impossible. They transformed a cold case into a solved case. They transformed uncertainty into established fact. And they demonstrated that while time changes investigators, laboratories, and technology, it does not necessarily change the truth. The truth remains. Sometimes hidden, sometimes silent, but always waiting for someone with the patience and the tools to uncover it. The conclusion of the April Tinsley investigation did not mark the end of its influence. Instead, it became a defining moment in the history of modern criminal investigation, illustrating how perseverance, scientific progress, and meticulous evidence preservation can intersect across generations. While the legal proceedings reached their conclusion, professionals throughout the fields of law enforcement, forensic science, and criminal justice continued studying the case, recognizing that its greatest significance extended well beyond a single conviction. It had fundamentally reshaped expectations about what was possible in cold case investigations. For decades, many investigators viewed certain unsolved murders through the limitations of the era in which they occurred. If traditional interviews produced no suspect, if eyewitnesses failed to identify the offender, and if early forensic methods reached their limits, cases often entered long periods of inactivity. Detectives never stopped caring about those investigations, but available technology simply offered few realistic opportunities for progress. The April Tinsley case demonstrated that this perspective required revision. Scientific capability is not fixed. It evolves continuously. Every unsolved investigation therefore exists within an environment that changes over time, creating opportunities unimaginable when the original crime occurred. One of the most enduring lessons from the investigation concerns patience. Not passive waiting, active patience. Cold case investigators do not simply store files on shelves and hope for miracles. They monitor developments in forensic science. They review technological advances. They evaluate whether preserved evidence may benefit from new analytical methods. They revisit investigative assumptions. Each review reflects the understanding that today's limitations may become tomorrow's breakthroughs. The April Tinsley investigation embodied exactly this philosophy. Every generation of investigators inherited evidence collected decades earlier. Rather than assuming previous detectives had exhausted every possibility, they asked whether modern science could ask better questions. That willingness to challenge earlier limitations ultimately transformed the investigation. The case also reinforced the extraordinary importance of institutional memory. Major investigations often span careers. Detectives retire. Supervisors transfer. Laboratory personnel change. Without comprehensive documentation, valuable investigative knowledge can gradually disappear. Throughout the April Tinsley investigation, detailed reports, carefully preserved evidence inventories, crime scene documentation, laboratory records, and interview summaries ensured continuity between generations of investigators. Every detective began where the previous investigator had finished. Nothing needed to be recreated. Nothing significant had been forgotten. This continuity allowed modern investigative techniques to build directly upon decades of earlier work. The relationship between traditional detective work and emerging forensic science also deserves careful attention. Public discussion sometimes portrays technological advances as replacing investigators. The April Tinsley case demonstrates the opposite. Technology expanded investigative possibilities. Detectives transformed those possibilities into evidence. Genealogical analysis suggested potential family relationships. Experienced investigators evaluated those leads. Surveillance established opportunities for obtaining a comparison DNA sample. Laboratory scientists confirmed the match. Prosecutors prepared the legal case. Every discipline depended upon the others. The investigation succeeded because scientific innovation complemented professional investigative practice rather than replacing it. Another important legacy involves public understanding of forensic evidence. DNA evidence is often described as conclusive, but its value depends upon careful collection, preservation, analysis, and interpretation. The biological evidence recovered in April 1988 became decisive only because every stage of its handling followed established forensic procedures. Crime scene technicians protected it. Evidence custodians preserved it. Laboratory scientists analyzed it according to evolving scientific standards. Investigators interpreted it within the broader factual context of the case. Each link in that chain proved essential. Had any portion failed, the investigation might have reached a very different outcome. The investigation further highlighted the importance of adapting investigative strategy to changing scientific capability. When detectives first examined the case, they relied primarily upon interviews, neighborhood canvasses, offender profiling, and conventional forensic analysis. As DNA technology matured, they incorporated increasingly sophisticated laboratory methods. When investigative genetic genealogy became available, they embraced another entirely new approach. This flexibility distinguished the investigation. Rather than remaining committed to outdated methods, investigators continuously adjusted their strategy to reflect current scientific knowledge. That adaptability remains one of the defining characteristics of successful cold case units today. The influence of the investigation extended internationally. Police agencies in numerous countries began examining whether similar genealogical techniques might assist their own unsolved homicide investigations, subject to local laws, privacy protections, and forensic capabilities. Professional organizations incorporated discussions of investigative genetic genealogy into conferences and training programs. Universities expanded forensic science curricula to include the principles demonstrated by cases like April Tinsley's. Researchers continued refining methods designed to improve both accuracy and efficiency. The investigation therefore contributed not only to one successful prosecution, but also to the broader advancement of forensic practice. The human dimension of the case remained central throughout these developments. Every scientific discussion ultimately returned to the memory of an 8-year-old child whose life ended far too soon. The investigation was never merely an academic exercise in genetics or criminal procedure. Its purpose remained constant from beginning to end: to identify the person responsible, to establish accountability through evidence, to provide truthful answers supported by fact. Those objectives guided every detective, scientist, prosecutor, and evidence technician who contributed to the case across nearly 3 decades. Another important lesson concerns the misconception that violent offenders inevitably escape justice if they avoid immediate arrest. Historically, this assumption occasionally reflected investigative reality. Modern forensic science increasingly challenges that belief. Properly preserved biological evidence retains remarkable value across time. As analytical methods improve, evidence collected decades earlier may reveal information previously inaccessible. This shift fundamentally changes the relationship between time and criminal investigation. Time no longer benefits offenders as predictably as it once did. Instead, time frequently benefits science. Every year brings improved laboratory capability, enhanced computational analysis, expanded forensic knowledge, additional investigative experience. The April Tinsley investigation illustrates this transformation with exceptional clarity. The offender remained unidentified for nearly 30 years, not because investigators lacked commitment, but because scientific capability required time to develop. Once that capability existed, decades of uncertainty began collapsing with surprising speed. Looking toward the future, the investigation continues influencing how agencies evaluate unresolved homicides. Evidence once considered unsuitable for analysis may warrant renewed examination. Cases previously categorized as unsolvable deserve periodic review. Investigators increasingly recognize that preserving evidence today protects investigative opportunities tomorrow. This philosophy encourages long-term thinking rarely visible outside professional criminal justice circles. Every properly documented crime scene, every securely stored biological sample, every carefully maintained evidence log, each may one day become the foundation of a future breakthrough. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of the April Tinsley investigation is that it reminds both investigators and the public of a simple truth. Justice is not measured solely by how quickly it arrives. It is measured by the commitment to continue pursuing the truth despite years of uncertainty. The investigation survived changing technology, changing personnel, changing forensic standards, and changing investigative philosophies. At every stage, professionals refused to abandon the evidence. That decision ultimately changed history. Today, the case remains one of the clearest demonstrations that cold cases are not frozen in time. They continue evolving. Science evolves. Investigative methods evolve. Understanding evolves. What once appeared impossible gradually becomes achievable. The murder of April Tinsley therefore stands not only as the resolution of a devastating crime, but also as a lasting reminder that truth can endure long beyond the limitations of any particular era. Evidence remembers. Science progresses. Persistence bridges the distance between them. And when those three forces finally converge, even the longest silence can ultimately give way to certainty. The story of the murder of April Tinsley ultimately became more than the account of a child whose life was stolen or of an investigation that lasted nearly 3 decades. It became a landmark in the continuing evolution of forensic science, reminding investigators around the world that every piece of preserved evidence carries the potential to answer questions that current technology cannot yet ask. Long after the courtroom proceedings concluded, the case continued shaping discussions inside police academies, forensic laboratories, universities, and prosecutor training programs. Detectives studying the investigation were not simply interested in how the offender had finally been identified. They wanted to understand why the evidence had survived, why the investigation remained viable across generations, and how future investigators could apply those lessons to thousands of other unsolved homicides. One of the most significant changes inspired by cases like April Tinsley's involved the philosophy surrounding cold case investigations themselves. For many years, unsolved murders were often viewed through the lens of diminishing opportunity. As time passed, witnesses became more difficult to locate, memories faded, physical environments changed, and investigative momentum slowed. While those challenges remain real, modern forensic science has fundamentally altered the equation. Today, many investigators recognize that certain forms of evidence become increasingly valuable over time because scientific capability continues improving. Biological evidence collected decades ago may reveal information impossible to recover when it was first examined. This shift has encouraged agencies to treat cold cases not as inactive files, but as investigations waiting for the next technological opportunity. Every advance in DNA analysis, every refinement in forensic genealogy, every improvement in laboratory sensitivity, each development creates new reasons to revisit preserved evidence. The April Tinsley investigation became one of the strongest demonstrations of that principle. Another enduring lesson concerns documentation. Professional investigators frequently emphasize that memories disappear, but documentation remains. The detectives who first investigated April's murder produced detailed reports describing crime scene conditions, witness interviews, evidence collection procedures, search efforts, and investigative decisions. Those documents later became indispensable resources for detectives who had not yet entered law enforcement when the crime occurred. Instead of beginning from uncertainty, they inherited a carefully organized investigative record capable of supporting modern forensic review. This continuity proved essential. Without comprehensive documentation, even the most advanced laboratory analysis would have lacked important investigative context. Evidence never exists in isolation. Its meaning depends upon accurate records describing where it was found, how it was preserved, and how it relates to other established facts. The investigation also demonstrated the extraordinary importance of collaboration across professional disciplines. No individual investigator possessed every skill necessary to solve the case. Crime scene specialists collected evidence. Forensic scientists analyzed biological material. Genealogists reconstructed family relationships. Detectives conducted surveillance and background investigations. Prosecutors prepared legal proceedings. Each contribution complemented the others. Modern criminal investigations increasingly depend upon exactly this type of interdisciplinary cooperation. Scientific innovation expands investigative possibilities. Professional collaboration transforms those possibilities into successful prosecutions. The case further illustrated how investigative strategies must remain adaptable. Had detectives relied exclusively upon methods available in 1988, the offender might never have been identified. Instead, successive generations continuously incorporated emerging scientific techniques while preserving the strengths of traditional police work. Neighborhood canvasses, witness interviews, behavioral analysis, forensic laboratory testing, investigative genealogy, DNA confirmation. Every method contributed something different. Together, they formed an investigative process far stronger than any single technique alone. Another important aspect of the case involved public confidence in the criminal justice system. High-profile unsolved murders often generate understandable frustration within affected communities. As years pass without arrests, public confidence may gradually decline. The successful resolution of the April Tinsley investigation demonstrated that persistence can eventually produce accountability even after decades of uncertainty. While justice delayed can never erase tragedy, successful investigations reaffirm an important principle. Violent crimes are not necessarily beyond the reach of the law simply because many years have passed. This message carries profound importance for families whose loved ones remain victims of unsolved homicides. Every cold case represents a family still waiting for answers. Every preserved evidence file represents continued possibility. Every scientific advancement offers renewed hope. The April Tinsley investigation reminds those families that time alone does not determine whether justice remains achievable. Within the forensic science community, the case continues influencing research priorities. Scientists strive to develop analytical methods capable of extracting reliable information from increasingly limited or degraded biological samples. Laboratories continually refine contamination prevention procedures. Researchers evaluate new computational approaches supporting genealogical analysis. Each advancement expands future investigative capability. Although these improvements often occur quietly inside research institutions rather than courtrooms, their long-term impact upon criminal investigations can be enormous. The relationship between technology and human judgment also deserves careful attention. Scientific instruments generate data. People interpret it. Investigators determine its significance. Prosecutors evaluate legal sufficiency. Judges oversee admissibility. Juries assess credibility. Throughout the April Tinsley investigation, every technological advancement remains subject to careful human evaluation. Science informed the investigation. Professional judgment directed it. That balance remains essential to maintaining public confidence in forensic evidence. Looking back across the full investigation, one observation becomes especially striking. The answer existed from the very beginning. The biological evidence identifying the offender had been present since April 1988. Nothing new had to be created. Nothing hidden suddenly emerged from nowhere. Instead, human knowledge gradually became capable of understanding information already preserved within that evidence. This realization fundamentally changes how many investigators view unsolved cases. Rather than asking whether evidence contains the answer, they increasingly ask whether current science has learned how to recognize it. That distinction encourages optimism grounded in evidence rather than speculation. The murder of April Tinsley therefore remains significant, not only because it was solved, but because it demonstrated the remarkable partnership between perseverance and scientific progress. Detectives refused to abandon the investigation. Evidence technicians preserved crucial materials. Scientists expanded forensic capability. Genealogists introduced innovative investigative methods. Prosecutors assembled the legal case. Each generation contributed something essential. None worked alone. Today, investigators confronting difficult cold cases frequently draw encouragement from this history. Not because every investigation will follow the same path. Every case is different. Evidence varies. Circumstances differ. Scientific opportunities are unique. But the underlying principle remains constant. Properly preserved evidence retains extraordinary potential. Persistent investigators continue asking better questions. Science continues providing better answers. That ongoing relationship ensures that the pursuit of justice does not end when headlines fade. It continues quietly inside evidence rooms, forensic laboratories, research institutions, detective bureaus, and courtrooms where professionals remain committed to uncovering the truth regardless of how much time has passed. The April Tinsley investigation stands as enduring proof that while criminals may outrun the science of one generation, they cannot assume they will outrun the science of the next. Time changes technology. It changes investigative methods. It changes understanding. But when evidence is preserved and determination remains unwavering, time itself can become one of justice's most powerful allies. Nearly 4 decades after April Tinsley climbed onto her bicycle on what seemed like an ordinary spring afternoon, her case continues to resonate far beyond the borders of Indiana. It is remembered not only because it ended with the identification and conviction of her killer, but because it fundamentally changed the way investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and the public think about cold cases. For many years, the phrase cold case carried an almost permanent sense of defeat, painful acknowledgement that the trail had gone cold, the witnesses had faded, and the offender had likely escaped accountability. The investigation into the murder of April Tinsley challenged that assumption in one of the most powerful ways imaginable. It demonstrated that a case may become cold, but evidence does not lose its ability to speak. Sometimes it simply waits for science to become capable of listening. Throughout the investigation, one principle remained remarkably consistent. Truth leaves traces. Sometimes those traces are visible. Sometimes they exist only under a microscope.